All right, why don't we go ahead and get going? So thank you everyone for joining AFAs 303. This is the third class in our AFAs webinar series. And this is an advanced educational class focused on AFAs for patent litigation matters, including optimal material deviation clauses. And I'm going to introduce Laura and Jerry and myself, but I just wanted to start by noting that none of us are patent litigators. So we don't hold ourselves as experts in patent law at all, but we have developed a fair bit of experience with alternative fee arrangements. And we've seen a lot of RFPs and AFAs for patent litigation matters. So we're excited to share with you what we've learned. And also would encourage you to ask questions throughout the session. We want it to be as interactive as possible. And you can do so by entering those questions into the Q&A button. And then we'll save some time at the end and we can open up the line if people want to ask questions verbally. So my name is David Falstein, so I head up the client strategy and success team. I have a background in law and business, worked in legal pricing roles before joining PERSUIT, and currently help our clients with rolling out new programs to implement PERSUIT, including programs that mandate the use of alternative fee arrangements across their legal departments. And I'm joined by two of my great colleagues, Laura Spalding and Jerry Zhang, who are also lawyers. So Laura was a commercial attorney before joining PERSUIT and worked in some legal tech roles before joining us. And Jerry also is a lawyer, former litigator, who worked in some tech roles as well before joining PERSUIT. So really excited to have them on to share their expertise as well. So what's on the agenda for today? We're going to start out by talking about, well, why is patent litigation an effective use case for RFP-driven alternative fee arrangements? Then we'll talk about different examples of scope of works for patent litigation. So what are the different ways in which clients run RFPs for patent litigations? So whether that be by using capped fees, a flat fee for the entire matter, activity-based fixed fees. So we'll go into a few examples. We'll also talk about the power of assumptions in the RFP process, how you can deal with changes in scope if you have an AFA and the matter changes later on. And we'll conclude with talking about the value of comparing strategies from amongst your panel firms to choose the best firm for your patent litigation matter. Before we start talking about examples and how to run RFPs and how to achieve AFAs for patent litigation, we start out by talking about what are the myths about AFAs in patent litigation. The first myth is that patent litigation is way too complex and the scope of work is too unpredictable to achieve an alternative fee arrangement. So Laura, what do you think? Is that true? And what are your thoughts on that?
Yes, that is true. So patent litigation, like most types of litigation, is unpredictable and it is complex. So you're not expected to know what's going to happen during the matter. But the most important thing is that you scope out the matter at the outset of the RFP process and then provide assumptions and quantify those assumptions. And that way, all of your firms can create an accurate alternative fee arrangement based on those same set of assumptions.
Okay. So, so by setting assumptions, you can achieve apples to apples comparison in price. That might be helpful for choosing the right firm, for being able to figure out which firm to choose. But then I'm still worried that I'm going to overpay. So I set my assumptions and I get proposals from firms, Jerry. But what I can still overpay if those assumptions are wrong, right? So so what's the point of doing that?
Right. So some of our clients will look at the total fixed fee and think, well, I've gotten a total fixed fee from the initial phase all the way through trial, and my case ends 2/3 of the way through or 1/3 of the way through at settlement. I'm on the hook for the total amount, right? So our response is really to think of the AFA process through PERSUIT as if you were asking several restaurants to provide you with their menu and the pricing for each menu item. And then at the end, sum up all their menu items into one total price. Well, just like a menu, you only pay for what you order, what you consume. And if you want to consume the entire menu, then you have that total fixed fee. So when you do get a total fixed fee and phase level pricing from PERSUIT, you have to think of it like a menu. You only pay for the work that's performed, but if the entirety of the work is performed, then you are covered by the total fixed fee. You're not on a hook for the total amount if any, the case ends at any different phase.
Okay. Okay. So, what I'm hearing from you both is, whilst patent litigation is complex and the scope of work is unpredictable, as long as I define my assumptions up front, I can more accurately compare proposed AFAs from multiple firms before choosing a firm, and I don't need to worry about overpaying, because if the scope of work changes, Jerry, what you're saying is I can use my sort of phase-based pricing to determine what I should be paying. So I'm not on the hook to pay the entire amount if the scope changes, so I shouldn't be as worried. But what the third thing we hear though is, well, what's the point of this comparing multiple AFAs and choosing a firm with a fixed fee or a cap fee or otherwise, if I've already negotiated really good hourly rates? So I've frozen my rates for 2 years. Firms are on a really discounted rate. So why do I need to cross compare AFAs? I could just cross compare the hourly rates, right? And just choose the firm. If I care about price, then I should just choose the firm that has the most effective hourly rates. Well, I just want to tell a quick story that just happened this week. So we had a client run an RFP for a large litigation matter, and they received 14 proposals from 14 of their panel law firms. So these are all firms that they have panel rates with. They've negotiated their hourly rates. They're happy with their hourly rates. They asked each of those 14 firms to submit an overall fixed fee broken down by phase, along with a success bonus for what the firm would charge to handle the entire matter from start to finish. After the firms submitted their proposals, the client was able to eliminate firms from the process and shortlist to a more limited number of firms, and then invite those firms to participate in a 1-hour reverse auction process where the remaining firms could actually drop their price based on where they stood. So they could actually see how their price compared to the other firms and drop their price. And we actually invited some of the lawyers from the in-house counsel team to actually watch the auction with us on a live watch party. And the head of litigations pointed out that one of the firms that was the lowest price, he said that firm has the highest hourly rates in the entire group. How is it that they could provide the lowest fixed fee when they have the highest hourly rates? And I said, that's a great question. Once you ask for an alternative fee arrangement, the firms, despite having higher hourly rates, can actually be more competitive than other firms, because that firm might know how to be more efficient with their time, first of all. Second of all, the firm is incentivized when under a fixed fee to channel more work to more junior resources, to be more leveraged in their staffing mix, and therefore they can provide an overall more effective fixed fee than you never would have known what the true cost of that firm would have been just by looking at the hourly rates. So the client was actually able to save over $1 million from the process, and they were able to choose a firm that they may have thought that they would have got a higher price for, and maybe they wouldn't have chosen that firm just looking at the hourly rates. So they actually were able to justify the selection of the firm that they wanted, while also getting a more effective overall price from that firm. So just shifting gears, so just give you an example of what we mean by a reverse auction. In the top left is just an anonymized example of the visual that displays the results of an auction process after you run one. So you can see that in this example of a patent litigation matter, you had 4 firms, with one firm starting at close to 4.5 million, and that firm dropped its price all the way down to $3.3 million. So a $1 million drop in price on their fixed fee because they could see how much higher their price was than their competitors, and they had an opportunity to revise their price. So it's not enough. So to address the client's concern about overpaying, if you're just negotiating with one firm to do an AFA with one firm, you might overpay because you have no idea where the competition stands, and you're not giving the firms an opportunity to revise their price based on feedback on where the market rate is. But if you run a competitive process, then you're going to feel way more comfortable about getting AFAs and feeling good about the AFA that you're agreeing to, and you won't feel as reliant on looking back at hourly billing to figure out whether you got a good deal. You'll know that you got a good deal based on the RFP process, not based on shadow billing. And as Jerry alluded to, you're going to have a menu of prices at the activity level. So even if the case settles or is dismissed early, you're not on the hook to pay the total fixed fee amount. You would only pay for the activities that actually performed at the activity level price. And so you can see at the bottom here an example of 4 capped fee proposals for one phase within the matter for the investigation phase. And so whether you engage with a capped fee or a fixed fee, you can actually use this process to cross-compare proposals from multiple firms, and you're much more well-informed on the firm that's going to be the most cost-effective by doing that process. So that's why, so hopefully that gives you all a sense of why an alternative fee arrangement is really a powerful way to get predictive pricing throughout the life of a patent litigation matter, despite the fact that these matters are complex. Because these matters are so large and there's so much spend on the line, firms really want to win your business for a patent litigation matter. So when you put firms in a competitive process, you're going to see significant price reductions because there's such a high desire to win these matters. So patent litigation has actually become, if not the most popular, the second most popular use case for competitive bidding and alternative fee arrangements across all of our PERSUIT clients. So now we want to talk about, well, what's the best way to set up an RFP or to set up an alternative fee arrangement for patent litigation? And we want to share a few different types of use cases. And there's no right or wrong way to do it, but we do want to share some insights and things that we've learned from seeing a few different ways to approach all AFAs for patent litigation. Laura, do you want to take us through the first example?
Yes, I will. Thanks, David. So this is a real RFP example from a client that scoped out a patent litigation matter. So they drafted this RFP before they sent it to at least 3 firms to participate and respond with their fixed fee proposals. And you can see there were 3 assumptions provided here. So this is still a good scope because we've set some assumptions. So we've said 2 IPRs, a Section 101 motion, and then normal matter activities. And that's okay. Normal matter activities is okay, but it leaves the scope very wide and quite loose. So the firms are going to come back with a lot of questions. And I remember with this particular RFP, there were a number of questions coming in from firms throughout the RFP process, wanting to understand those assumptions more so that they could know that their neighbor was creating the same fixed fee proposal based on the same set of assumptions. So before we jump into the result of this RFP or what the outcome was based on this scope, we wanted to run a little poll to see if the audience can guess what the price variance was. So what the percentage spread in the proposals that came back from the firms. So let's say we had 4 proposals. What was the percentage difference between the lowest price proposal and the highest price, remembering that these are fixed fee proposals?
Yeah, so we give a few seconds to answer the questions. And just while you're submitting your answers, I just want to remind everyone, if you joined late, if you have any questions, feel free, or comments, please, we would encourage them, submit them via the Q&A button, and then we can either answer them as we go, or we'll save some time at the end to answer them. So a flat fee to handle the entire patent litigation matter, 3 assumptions provided. What's the difference between the highest price firm and the lowest price firm. What's the percentage difference there? We'll go ahead and end the polling now.
So remembering that the goal here is to get apples to apples proposals from your firm. So when you scope out the matter, you want your firms to know that they are basing their fixed fee on the same assumptions that their neighbor is. So what are the results here? Most people said between 100 and 500-ish% would be pretty standard. And it's complex litigation work. So I think most people would assume that the spread is quite high anyway. But David, do you want to reveal what the actual price variance spread was in the end?
Okay, yeah, so most of you said maybe 100% price variance. Let's here. The actual price variance?
960%. So the lowest proposal was $710,000 and the highest proposal was 7.9 million. So the result here, what we can learn from that is that the scope was too flexible for the firms to come in all at the same range in price. Obviously, there's always going to be range between the highest and lowest proposal, but 960% indicates that the firms were all basing their proposal on different assumptions.
And we also we want to also confirm that these are all like for like firms. So there was no, it wasn't like one firm was significantly different in their, the size of the firm, or these were all preferred firms. These were all firms that the client would have chosen, would have chosen based on, a typical matter. It's not something that they invited a new firm that they never used before. All right, so let's look at another example. Jerry, do you want to take us through the second example?
Sure, David. So if you look at this example, just at first glance, you'll immediately notice that this RFP was scoped in more detail, broken down by more than 3 phases, but 7 phases through investigation to trial. And within each phase, this client added sub-items. So from the client side, there's a more distinct clarity in terms of this is what I'm seeking pricing for from the firms. And then at the firm side, it's clear to the firms, these are the different items and sub-items that we're providing prices for. Now, some slight nuance from the previous example, this is asking for capped fees at the phase level, but similar to the other example, this is all top quality firms. And this was, I believe, 3 or more firms involved in this process. So by contrast, again, many more phases, and then sub-phases, much more level of granularity. But if you read the phases, I'm sure some attorneys on the call here will see that there is some broadness in the ways that these phases are in. So let's all do a poll now and see, in contrast to the previous scope, what we think the variance in spread is for this RFP. Again, this was a real example run on a patent litigation matter. I see the numbers coming in much even polling compared to the last. It looks like many more people think that the spread will be smaller due to the increased clarity and more refinement in the scoping and more detail.
All right, we can now share the results. So now you can see the results come in. It looks like the winner is 30 to 50%. That's the highest. Most people think the spread is between 30 to 50%, but it kind of answers all over the board. Jerry, were they right? Were they right on the money?
Let's do the reveal, David, without further ado. The actual variance was actually higher, 100% variance, despite the added levels of detail and granularity. And David, in the next case, will kind of go and kind of take us to the other example of scoping that I think takes it one step further than this.
All right, a third example. So in this example, very similar scope of, similar in the sense that we've got similar phases written out, and we've also have similar activities listed out for the firms. And of course, we're not, don't look too much at the total prices here, because the total prices are obviously indicative of there's specific claims that are provided. The specific claim is attached. The firms are going to have nuance, more nuance than what's just listed here, besides just the activities, right? But want to also get your thoughts on this example. What do you think the spread is in pricing? In this example, instead of it being capped fees by phase, we've got fixed fees by phase. But we also have assumptions on the number of depositions. So the number of depositions of the plaintiff, number of depositions of the company, the number of expert deps. And we also have provided the firms the ability to define what would the fixed fee amount be if that assumption was wrong. So the firms can come in and give a fee per deposition in case there's a material deviation. So does this lead to a change in the variance? So let's go and start the polling. Does this make a difference? So all we've done is added a few quantities. We haven't quantified everything. So do we think that's going to make any kind of a difference? All right, we'll give it a couple other seconds to let everyone vote. All right, we'll go ahead and end the polling and share the results. So we got 55% of the audience that says 35%, or 30 to 50%, 36% say 50 to 100, 9% say over 100 to 200% price variance. Let's do the big reveal. So were people right on the money, with the most popular being 30 to 50%? And you guys got it right this time. So the audience wins. 38% was the price variance. So spread between the highest price, 4.9 million, lowest price, 3.6 million on this example. So Laura, why is it, why do we think that is? Why is it, is it even meaningful that, the fixed fee, phase example, the third example, there's a lower variance than the other two? What do you think is the reason for that?
Yeah, so when you provide assumptions in your scope, the firms are able to create a fixed fee cost at the phase level and based on those cost drivers. So they look at the quantities and they look at what is the most likely trajectory of the matter, or the most likely scenario, and then they build their price based on those assumptions, so each of those quantities. So the best thing about that is that when you go into a reverse auction process with the firms feeling confident that each of their neighbor firms have created the same price created their fee proposals based on the same set of assumptions, they know that they're apples to apples, and they feel more confident making a price reduction to be more competitive or more in line with the market. Because they know that those assumptions are the same across the board. So the more granular that you get with your assumptions, the better the result during the auction. So you'll still have, in the initial proposals, you'll still have a price variance between the firms. But during the auction, the point is that the firms get to see high level where they're positioned in terms of price. And so they have the ability, and they're more confident in dropping their price in line with the market when they know that the firm next to them is assuming the same number of depositions and the same number of experts. And what we see during an auction, some of the best results come from those auctions that show price during the auction at the phase level, because the firms can see not only my total fixed fee, how it compares across my competitor firms, but I can see at each phase of the matter. So I can see in phase 2 discovery, where my discovery fee in that phase compares across the board to my other firms. And if I know that mine is based on the same set of quantified assumptions as my neighbor, then I would be more comfortable reducing my price in line with the others. So you only need to list the quantified assumptions for the key cost drivers. So you don't need to quantify every single activity or service that's going to be provided in the course of the matter. So when you're scoping out your matters, think about what are the 5 or 6 or 3 or 4 major cost driving activities that may take place or are most likely to take place during the course of the matter. Even if you have to think of the 5 cost driving activities in all scenarios, list them out first and then consider what the number of them may be. And you can either, if you have no idea, you can either guess based on what is typical for that matter type, or you can put it to your firms during the RFP process and have them come back and say, well, based on my reading of this case and based on my strategies, this is what I think the assumptions might be. And then you can go through that process of truing up or standardizing that set of assumptions before the auction takes place.
And so you think, so, and just to add on to that point, just these 4 bullets here, the number of witnesses, the number of experts, number of trial days, just doing that, you don't need to quantify everything. Literally just that has a huge effect on the proposals, has a huge effect on the firm's confidence in knowing the overall price, because those things drive the cost of everything else. You know, the number of witnesses is going to drive the amount of prep work involved. The number of experts is going to drive the amount of prep work involved, the amount of strategy involved. So much of the other work is driven off of these quantities. And so these are the quantities that can vary to such a high degree that's why, you know, we don't need to boil the ocean. You don't need to say how many cases you're going to look up during your research. You know, we don't need to define everything so granularly. Just these few things make a huge difference. But I'm going to come to Jerry. But Jerry, why would I give the firms this information? Shouldn't they tell me? And also, how do I handle, like, I don't know. I have no idea how, like, I don't know, like, I need the firms to start working before I know how many experts there's going to be. You know, I don't know how many depositions there are going to be at the start of the matter. So why would I give assumptions if they're going to be wrong? What's the point of giving assumptions if they're just going to be wrong, right? How do we deal with that?
Yeah, sure, David. So again, the exercise of putting in an RFP AFA through this process is you're seeking a menu of pricing from firms that have to be anchored to some sort of unit, so that at the onset, when all the firms are bidding for your business, the client has the most leverage, and the burden is on the firms to do the math, put a price together that makes business sense, and then have to commit to that price should the matter kind of see its full fruition. And on the client side, you ideally would like to price the matter for the entire life cycle, even if everyone knows most cases settle, don't really have that many trials these days. But let's assume you make a wrong assumption as a client, you priced only up to the summary judgment motion, and then there's a pending trial looming that you're facing, and now the leverage shifts to the firm, and then it's harder for the client to renegotiate now that they've had the firm that have done all this work up to this point. That as a client, you're in a weaker spot. But if you had that menu, you can always reference that menu and say, look, you priced us this much per day of trial. You promised this level of attorney for this trial for our matter. So you are tied to that price and for those commitments. And so that's why it's really best practice to really scope out the entire life cycle of the matter, even if you don't anticipate it really seeing it through. And even with the best crafted AFAs, there always will be variations, deviations. And so David now is going to talk about how we account for that when there is a material deviation.
Thanks, Jared. All right, so we want to give an example of some language that you can use and put this into your RFP, or even if you're engaging with one firm and you're negotiating an AFA, you can use this language. And one thing I want to point out too, you can use this even if you're doing capped fees. So even if you're doing capped fees, you want to define what is a material deviation, because if one firm thought that there's going to be 10 depositions and there ended up being 30, well, is it fair to hold the firm to the capped fee for just the discovery phase of, let's say, $500,000, when the work has changed materially, and there's 3 times as much work, is it fair to hold the firm to the cap? And so the firm would probably say we need to adjust the cap up, right? So if you haven't defined the number of assumptions in the phase, how do you know how much to increase the price by? So it's really important, even if you're doing a cap fee, to define your assumptions at every phase, even if you're going to be wrong, and then have some language like this that says, look, if there's a 30% increase or decrease in the assumptions we've provided, then we'll adjust the price. If there's only a 10% change in the quantity of activities, well, that's not enough. That's not a big enough change. So let's not deal with having to negotiate every single time there's a tiny 10% change in quantity of activities. But if there's a 30% change, okay, then that's enough to trigger the need to adjust the price. And it happens not only on the high end, but also on the low end. So if we said we assumed 10 depositions and we only needed 5, well, that's more than a 30% change. So now we would adjust the price downward, and we have a price per deposition that's been proposed in the RFP. So we know exactly how much to reduce the price by. So that helps you to adjust your AFA without having to go back and look at the hourly billing. Because if you're asking for hourly billing throughout the life of the matter, that might be helpful for informational purposes, so you know what the firms are doing. But if you're using the hourly bill as the mechanism to adjust the AFA, then what's the point of billing? What's the point of the AFA if the amount of effort is going to dictate what price you're paying? Like, that's why we're trying to get away from hourly billing, is because we don't want the amount of effort involved to dictate what you should pay. What you should pay should be dependent on the RFP process, the competitive process that determines what an effective price, what a fair price is. And so this is a really good way to have a fair process for both you and the firm, so you both feel comfortable with the process. You've provided the assumptions. All the proposals that come in are apples to apples on the same set of assumptions. For that reason, the firms feel comfortable dropping their price because they know that they're bidding on the same work that the other firms are bidding on. You get the most competitive price possible. And then both sides feel comfortable that, hey, if my assumptions are wrong, I know how I'm going to change the price if there's a significant change in those assumptions. I know we had a question that came in asking if we see differences in terms of price and AFA proposals during the RFP process. To what extent could those differences be attributed to the vague assumptions versus maybe some other reason? I think that's a great question, and I don't know that we have a definitive for sure answer to that. But we do know is that average savings across all requests, and we measure savings by the difference between the proposal you select and the average proposal. So that delta on average is 37%. So I'd say that 37% is probably, that's a fair delta between maybe the low and the middle. But you don't always select the lowest bidder. So I don't know that we can definitively answer whether it's the vagueness in the assumptions that that attribute to the widespread, because we know that even with the same set of assumptions, like in the third example, we gave firms really clear assumptions. We gave quantified activity assumptions, and there is still more than a 30% delta between the low bid and the high bid. So that's going to be more so attributed to the fact that there are differences in price between the firms. Some firms can provide a much more effective price on an AFA than another firm. Some firms have a lot more capacity at a given point in time. So firm A in one matter with the same scope might be $2 million, and then in the next matter that same firm might be 1.5 million, because they just came off of a big matter for another client. They have a lot of people sitting on their hands, and now because they have that extra capacity, they can provide a more discounted fee arrangement. Or they realize that because they've been doing more work under AFA, now that we're not billing hourly, we might be able to channel more of the work to more junior resources. But and that allows us to reduce our overhead, reduce our cost to serve the client, and therefore we can provide a lower fixed fee. but still deliver the same outcome for the client on a lower cost. So the firm can be more profitable while also charging the client less. And so the reason I say that is some firms have figured that out, and maybe other firms haven't. And that is often a big reason for the spread, not just because there's a vague scope, but because some firms can just be more efficient and more leverage in their staffing and provide an overall lower cost than another firm, even with the same hourly rates. So the vagueness and the assumptions is just one piece of that, but we don't want to also forget that there's just natural differences between the firms that cause some really large gaps in price. And that's why it's so critical to engage in a competitive RFP process before you choose a firm. Because if you don't do that, you could be significantly overpaying on a matter-by-matter basis. Are there any other questions before I kick it over to Laura to talk a little bit about some of the qualitative benefits in terms of the RFP process beyond pricing? If there are any other questions, please feel free to submit them in the Q&A.
Thanks, David. And I just want to add before I switch over to this topic that during the RFP process, you would list out your assumptions and scope the matter at the outset. But I would normally also ask firms to list any additional assumptions or exclusions that they come up with when creating their fee proposals, because maybe there are things that I haven't thought of. So before the auction takes place, you would normally go in and review the proposals at a high level. And usually you can tell if there's an outlier that there is a mismatch in the assumptions there. And in the detail in their proposal, you can see what it is that's causing that mismatch in assumptions. And that's why it's important also to get your fixed fee broken out by phase or by activity so that you can see where the biggest outlier fees are sitting. And work with the firm to work out why they're so different to their neighboring firms. There was another question in here. David, do you want to take that one about billing?
Yeah, 1 second. Just pause my screen sharing. So another question about how do you handle the billing? So how do you handle the billing? Let's say you've got proposals, you got pricing broken down by phase, by activity, and this is not a patent litigation example, but just to give you a sense of how that might look in a comparative RFP process where you're getting multiple AFAs from multiple firms. How do the firms invoice you? So that's a great question. There's two approaches when you have a fixed fee. And so I'm going to talk about this not in the context of a cap fee, because a cap fee is a little easier. The firms bill you hourly, and then once they hit the cap, either you can set up your invoicing system to where it rejects all invoices that are submitted that exceed the cap. So that's a little bit easier. Is if you're billing under a cap fee, is bill hourly up until the cap for each phase, and you need to work with your billing system to set that cap at each phase level. The other way to invoice it is if you do a fixed fee, you can take the total price of the matter, let's say $1 million, and divide that by 12 and bill a monthly pro rata amount with a single line item. So whatever it is, let's say $200,000 a month, or let's say $50,000 a month, you bill us $50,000 every single month for this defined period of time. And that's just one pro rata amount of the overall price. We'll meet every 6 months and say, has there been a material deviation? Yes or no. If there hasn't been a material deviation, then we will keep the billing as is. If there has been a material deviation, then let's discuss a true up at that point in time. And that way you're not having to deal with thousands of line items of invoices to review. You've already got a fixed fee. You have the clarity. Just bill a single line item invoice, pro rata amount, every single month. And it's as simple as that. For the purposes of billing. Clients you might say, well, I still want to see the shadow bill to figure out what the firm is doing, or to figure out whether I got a good deal in the AFA. I would discourage you from using the shadow bill to figure out whether you got a good deal, because you ran an RFP process. You know what the price you got was compared to the market. And the delta between the price you paid and the market price, that's your savings, right? That's how you know you got a good deal. So I don't think it's, in the reasonable minds differ on this, but I don't think it's fair to ask firms for a shadow bill and use that as the basis to determine whether you got a fair price. But by running the competitive process, right, you're allowing the firms to drop their price to be more competitive. So the firms are coming closer and closer together in price. What happens then is that you achieve what we call true market price. You got the best price that the market could bear, and that takes price almost completely out of the equation. You got the best price the market could bear. Now you can just choose the firm that's most likely to deliver the best outcome for you as the client. And so, Laura, what are some good questions, I guess, that clients will often ask to figure out who is going to be the best firm for the matter?
Yeah, we've seen clients ask all sorts of questions in the qualitative aspect of the RFP process. So part of the RFP is price, but there is a huge qualitative section of the RFP where you can get some really good insights from your firm during the RFP process. So early case assessment and insights. So what are your initial impressions of this case? What do you think is going to be the best outcome? Do you see it settling early or going to trial? What is your experience with the subject matter? So particular patent types and industries. What is your experience with the trial judge? And what are your strategies for success? So the strategy question is the one that we get the most positive feedback from, because attorneys will go through the RFP process and they'll have an incumbent firm that they're used to working with for the last several years on the same types of patent litigation work. And then in the RFP process, they're encouraged to give other top firms the opportunity to bid on that work. And they think about that as, well, maybe we might get a better price, but it's not necessarily always about that. You can actually go through this process, and we've had attorneys say, well, I've been using this firm for years, and because I went through this process, I was 100% certain I was still going to go maybe with this firm. This was my preferred firm. But by going through this process, I actually got 4 really succinct and really nice strategies from 4 top firms in this space. 2 of them I'd never worked with before. And of those 2, there was one that I was really impressed with. And not only did they have a great market price, but they actually had a better strategy than the firm that I'm used to working with. So I went with that firm and created a new relationship, and they wouldn't have been able to do that if they'd gone through this process manually, because you don't normally get that qualitative insight from your firms during a manual process of engagement.
We actually had our data scientists look back at, for one of our clients recently, look back at, they had done over 100 RFPs in a year. And we had our data scientists look back and say, how much information was the client getting with respect to strategies proposed from firms across all these RFPs? What was the value of that, of all those free strategic advices that were given by all of these top tier firms? And our data scientists came back and said, on average, answers are 6 pages long with respect to strategies. The firms dissect the complaint, dissect all the issues, they spot all the issues in the case for you, and they come back to you with so many insights. And so you, as the managing attorney, are getting insights from 3, 4, 5 of your go-to panel firms. Think about how much more armed you are with information. Even though you're only going to choose one of those firms, you're way more armed with information about all the issues involved before you've even started working on the matter. So that value, and when you calculate that, we estimated that the value of each of those strategic advices was $10,000 was what you'd likely have paid for a firm for that strategic advice narrative. The client got $2 million in free value just from those strategic advices alone, from the RFP process. We have a question in the Q&A asking, what is the success criteria for a successful e-auction? So one thing just as a caveat is there's no obligation to select the lowest bidder. In fact, the lowest bidder is not even selected most of the time. Lowest bidder is only selected 18% of the time. So clients know and that use PERSUIT know you're not under any obligation to select the lowest bidder. You review all the proposals holistically, and then you choose the firm that is most likely to deliver the best outcome at that firm's best price. So the success criteria of running an auction is, did you get the best firm for the matter? And that's based on whatever you've defined as what's important to you for that particular matter. In a patent litigation, maybe it's experience with that particular type of product, their experience in the venue. So asking really pointed questions about that will help you to tease out which firm is most likely to deliver the best outcome for that particular matter. So as long as you've evaluated that and made a selection decision based on that, you've had a successful e-auction, regardless of how many price drops you've got in the auction. Because if the firms don't drop their price, you feel confident, well, I got the best price that the market could bear. I got the best price that this firm was willing to offer for the work. So even if they don't drop the price, that's still success because you did a competitive process and you got the best firm for the matter. But if you're looking for metrics on what our average drops, we see on average, the market average drops 17% on average from start to auction to end of auction. And so if you're looking for specific data on what type of drops you should be seeing, that's an average. But the average does vary depending on how many firms are invited. And it varies depending on what the size of the matter is. So the larger the matter, the more price drops we see than if you're bidding on a smaller matter. Yeah, so another question is, could you share any insights into which auctions ended up with a poor result and what the clients got wrong and what they should do differently? So just because you got a poor result doesn't mean you did anything wrong necessarily. It could just be that, like we talked about earlier, the firms don't have any extra capacity. So if the firms are extremely busy, they've got a lot of work, they've got so many matters that they're handling, and it's going to hurt them more to drop their price because considering the alternative, they already have a lot of demand, then the firms won't drop their price. And so if the firms really want the work, they'll drop their price. So I wouldn't say that just because you didn't have a lot of price movement that it wasn't a success, as I was talking about earlier. As long as you got the best price the market could bear, you should be happy with that. But as we've been talking about earlier, if you don't provide enough assumptions and you've got proposals that are not apples to apples, that can lead to a lack of price movement. Because if the firms feel like they're bidding on a different scope of work than what another firm's bidding on, then they're going to be less likely to want to drop their price because they don't feel confident that they're actually higher, right? If I think I'm bidding on 10 depositions and the other firms are bidding on 1 deposition, well, I don't care that my price is higher than those firms, so I'm not going to drop my price. And so if the firms don't have a high level of confidence in the scope of work, then they're going to be less likely to drop their price. Another question, can I still select the highest bidder? Absolutely. Still select the highest bidder. There's nothing, and that's communicated to the firms know, there's absolutely no obligation upon you to choose a particular firm, regardless of where they rank. In fact, clients often feel the highest bidder because they came much closer to the average. If that highest bidder is the best firm for the matter, all you did was you got a significantly better price from that highest bidder, and you went with the firm that was most likely to deliver the right outcome for you. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with choosing the highest bidder if you feel like you still got a fair price and you're most likely to get the best outcome from that firm. Jerry, Laura, anything that I missed or anything you would add on to those answers?
I would add something just to the question about the success of e-auctions and what clients may have done wrong. So like David said, doesn't necessarily mean that you've done anything wrong, but there are some things that we've seen improve the results of an auction, some small things that you can do to encourage more movement during an auction, and that is invite more firms. So we recommend at least 3 firms. That's not to say that auctions still aren't successful with 2 firms, but 5 to 7 firms is also a really good number to invite if you can. Show price. So from the insights that we've gathered from our data, showing price and giving the firms more transparency, not just at the total price level, but at the phase level. So showing them what are the other firms' prices at each of those levels and how do they compare to yours can make the firms feel more confident bidding at the phase level. And then also just going through a process of before the auction and taking the time to look at the proposals, make sure there's no outliers, check the assumptions on there and communicate with your firms. You might like to release a clarification on the RFP and say, just confirming this is the standard set of assumptions that you should all be basing your fees on, and take a moment before the auction to adjust your price so that it is based on these assumptions. And just by giving that message, the firms will feel more confident during the auction.
And I would just add on one more point in terms of what is the setting for the ideal length of an actual live auction. And just empirically from what we've seen, most of the bidding drops tend to happen within the last half hour or so. So we've heard, certain firms would like a larger window of time to go and get price approvals. But given that a lot of the activity does happen at the tail end, even if the auction was set for several hours long, firms don't necessarily have the information of what their competitors will do price-wise up until the last 30 minutes anyways. So they would still face that time crunch. So generally speaking, kind of when you're considering how long should I set my auction, just based on what we've seen, the last 30 minutes is sufficient time for most of the activity and price drops to happen.
Yep, absolutely. And we've analyzed the data. There's no significant difference between auctions that are 24 hours versus, or 8 hours versus 30-minute auctions. We don't see any, significantly better results for ones that are longer. We have a question about cultural differences. So are certain jurisdictions more likely to drop their price, firms from those jurisdictions? I just want to note, we've had RFPs in North America, Latin America, Europe, and Asia. We've never had any in Africa, so we have no data there. But we have not seen any significant differences in any of those global regions. So from a global perspective, we see success across the board. There hasn't been a particular culture that's really more resistant to doing this than others. So hopefully that helps. And I don't think we've noticed, I don't know if Laura or Jerry, you disagree, any differences within the United States between regions on the results. Most of the firms that participate, 98% of the global 100 firms are participating in PERSUIT. These firms are so large and global in nature. We do have smaller firms participating as well, but most of these firms from region to region have arms across the world. So we haven't really been able to notice any significant differences there. We have a question asking whether we can create patent litigation templates tailored to specific companies. Absolutely. So that's what Laura, Jerry, and I are here for, is once you're a client with us, we can work with you to set up a few different types of templates. So if you want a fixed fee template, a cap fee template, and you want to adjust it depending on the matter type, we can help you set up some templates so that way there's nothing that you need to do besides go in, adjust the quantity of activities like we talked about, change the number of depositions, maybe add in the number of documents for review, things like that you might anticipate. And that's all, that's it. Attach the complaint, send it on your way. We already have best practice questions about the firm's experience, strategies for success. All of that is already baked in. So all you need to do is make a couple of tweaks and send it, and you're ready to go. Do you see examples where law firms decline to participate in e-auctions? Laura, do you see any examples?
I don't really see examples where firms will decline to participate in the RFP process because there's an e-auction. Usually if a firm doesn't want to participate in an e-auction, they will just not change their price during the auction. Obviously firms conflicted out sometimes and have other reasons why they might choose not to participate. But I am guessing that question is more around the firm's response to the auction feature in particular. The feedback that we have from firms generally is that they like it because they get the transparency where they otherwise wouldn't have it. So when you're providing fee proposals for your services in any industry, you don't usually get to know why it is that you're not being given the work, or when you might even not even know when you're missing out on the work or what work you're not being invited to. And during the reverse auction process, at least you have that transparency to see, well, if you can't change your price, if you're the highest price firm and you can't budge, then at least you know why. And you know that your competitors or the market price sits a little bit lower than you. So it's completely up to the firms whether or not they'd like to bid or change their price during the auction. But we've never really had a firm say that they would choose not to have that transparency at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. Firms, they'd much rather know that they're the highest price firm and have a chance to change than just to be eliminated. And then they had no idea that they were the highest price firm. They had no feedback. Firms rather have transparency of the feedback. And as Laura and Jerry mentioned earlier, showing the actual anonymous price of all the firms has led to better results than even just showing the firms they're ranking. So what we found is more transparency the better for purposes of driving price movement. Any other questions? Also, if anybody wants to ask a question live, you can feel free to click the raise your hand button, and then we can also call on you. All right.
There was one last question in there, David, in the Q&A.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understand this last one. Do you see examples where the client rewards the result and how to structure such e-auctions? I don't know if whoever wrote that one, if you want to send another question just with a little more clarity, we'd be happy to answer it, but I'm not sure I understand that question.
Okay, and while we're just waiting for that, I'll just add that if you have an RFP or a matter come in the door that you need to scope, David and Jerry and I are here if you want to jump on a one-on-one scoping call, and we would go through that matter and help you set out that scope and consider those assumptions and draft the RFP. So you can email David, you can email any of us, but David's is david@PERSUIT.com, much easier email than ours. Reach out to him and we can set up a call.
Yeah, and if you want the slide deck, also email me, david@PERSUIT.com, and we'll be happy to provide that to you. There are no other questions. Thank you all so much for joining. We'll stop our recording now.